Our lecture for today focuses on material from Louis Vaughn's Doing Ethics, and specifically we're looking at the chapter called Ethics and the Examined Life. So you'll want to get your textbook, read that chapter, and this lecture draws on material from that chapter. So the first question we're going to consider is just the question, what is ethics? Ethics is the philosophical study of morality. And by morality, all we mean is beliefs that you have concerning right and wrong. That's a very basic, simple definition of morality. And I think it's important to point out that this class is a philosophical study. So we might also call it a moral philosophy course. And that's important because many people, when they sign up for this class, don't realize that this is actually a class in philosophy. The title of this class is Philosophy 220, Introduction to Ethics. And so it's helpful to know what exactly is philosophy. And I really like this definition by the philosopher Alvin Plantinga, who says that philosophy is simply thinking hard and precisely about something. That's all you're doing when you're doing philosophy, is you're thinking hard and precisely about something. And so what that means is everyone actually is a philosopher. You either are doing philosophy well or you're doing philosophy not so well. So if we take that definition of philosophy and we apply it to morality, then we might say that ethics or moral philosophy is just thinking hard and precisely about moral and social issues. That's all that ethics is. Now, obviously, it's more than that because people have been thinking about moral and social issues for hundreds and thousands of years. So it's really helpful in an ethics class for us to learn from people who have gone before us about what they thought about moral and social issues. So we'll be doing that a little bit in this class. So if that's what ethics is, what does it mean to be doing ethics? That's the title of the textbook. And it means at least four things. It means deliberating about the rightness or wrongness of actions. So just thinking carefully about the rightness and wrongness of actions. It means judging the goodness of your character or your intentions. So when we're doing ethics, we're not just looking at the things that we do, but we're also looking at our intentions and our character as a person. It's examining the soundness of your moral outlook, and this is where logic comes into doing ethics course, because soundness is thinking about whether or not premises add up to a certain conclusion or not. So you're trying to figure out, is this argument valid? Is this argument sound? And when you're talking about the soundness of your moral outlook, you're really getting into moral argumentation, which we're going to be looking at in a future lecture. But you also question whether your moral decisions rest on coherent presuppositions. And that's one of the things that you're going to recognize throughout this class, is that all the arguments that we make for different moral positions at bottom rest on some presuppositions, and presuppositions cannot be verified by direct evidence. They're ideas that you start with, axioms that you start with, and then you try to see where do those axioms lead logically. And so again, we're going to get into that, those types of questions later on as we work through this course. So if we think about some basic questions of ethics that we might ask, one basic question is the question of what is the greatest good? That is perhaps one of the more fundamental ethical questions, is what is the greatest good? And so to apply that question to you taking this class right now, if I were to ask you what is a goal that you have in this class, you might say, one of my goals is to get an A in this class. And I ask you the question, why do you want to get an A in this class? You might say something like, well, I want to graduate with a good GPA in college. We say, okay, that's fair enough. Why do you want to do that? Why do you want to graduate SDSU with a good GPA? You might say, because I want to get a good job after I'm done with the university. Okay, so why do you want to do that? Well, if I get a good job, I'll make a lot of money. Why is money important to you? Because I want to be able to take care of my family. Notice as we keep working through this progression, you are giving me a deeper answer to the question of what motivates you. And whenever you go through a series of questions like this, you're thinking about the greatest good, whether you realize it or not. And the question of what is the greatest good is very similar to the question for you, what is your deepest why? What is the thing at bottom that motivates you? Some people, when they get to this level of the discussion, might turn to their faith or religious commitments to answer the question of what is their deepest why. But again, that frames whatever you think about what the greatest good is. And some will turn to more broad ethical principles, philosophical principles, such as principles like happiness. Happiness is the thing that I want most in life. Liberty, freedom, the ability to do whatever I want is the thing that I want the most in life. But however you answer those questions, you are getting to a fundamental ethical question of what is the greatest good. And when you answer that question, that forms other questions and forms how you answer other questions, such as the question of what goals should I be pursuing in life? And when you answer those questions, that gets into questions about virtues. What types of virtues should I cultivate? Because as you cultivate virtues in your life, that shapes the character of who you are, which is the question, what type of person do I want to become? So fast forward to late in life, when you are in your 70s, your 80s, and you're looking back on everything that you've done, what type of person do you want to have become by that point? Whenever you think about those types of questions, you're asking ethical questions and you're doing ethics. That's what ethics is. Now, ethics can be divided into two basic divisions. So there's what we might call descriptive ethics, which really is not, like, we'll do a little bit of this in this class, but that's not what this class is. If you're doing descriptive ethics, that's sort of like sociology or psychology. It's the science of studying moral beliefs and practices. So you can go to a culture that you're completely unfamiliar with, and you can do a scientific study of how do those people behave, act, what are their religious beliefs, moral beliefs, and that's really just doing sociology. Or you can do that at an individual level, and you can ask this about certain individual people, like what do they, if you're reading a biography of someone, what did they care about and what were their practices? That's just doing psychology. Now, the aim of descriptive ethics is to describe and explain how people actually behave and think when dealing with moral issues. And so that's descriptive ethics. What this class is more philosophical ethics, as I already mentioned, which consists of three major divisions. So under the category of philosophical ethics, there is normative ethics, there is meta-ethics, and there is applied ethics. And so I want to walk through each of these briefly. So let's start with normative ethics. Normative ethics is the study of principles, rules, or theories that guide actions. And the purpose of this approach to ethics is to try to establish the soundness of moral norms. And so I want to give you just a couple examples of questions that you might ask when doing normative ethics. So one question is the question, is happiness the greatest good in life? Or another question is, should the rightness of actions be judged by their consequences? So in normative ethics, I'm giving you three possible principles here that someone might be studying in normative ethics just to try to help you understand these questions. So there's an approach to ethics called utilitarianism, and in this case, we're going to have someone named Sarah who is going to be a utilitarian. Then we have libertarianism, and Miles is going to be the libertarian. And then we have egalitarianism, which Jordan is going to represent the egalitarian position. So these are three different normative principles that someone might be arguing from. Now, when you're doing normative ethics, you're trying to figure out, are these good moral principles? And so the utilitarian is somebody that argues for a happiness principle. And the utilitarian says we ought to promote happiness for the greatest amount of people. And what you do in normative ethics is you're trying to figure out, is that a sound and coherent position? And so we do thought experiments to try to figure out whether or not this principle holds in every moral situation. The same would be true with libertarianism. So the libertarian disagrees with the utilitarian. So Miles disagrees with Sarah and says we shouldn't do what promotes the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people. Instead, what we ought to do is promote individual rights. And if that makes the majority upset, so be it. What we ought to be about when we're doing ethics is to make sure that everyone is treated as an individual, and that is the correct thing to do. And Jordan, as an egalitarian, disagrees with both of these positions and says instead what we ought to do is promote a principle of fairness. And so what you're doing in normative ethics is you're trying to evaluate these principles to see whether or not they are sound principles. The next philosophical approach is meta-ethics. And what you're doing in meta-ethics is you're trying to figure out if there's a standard that can ground any of these principles. And so meta-ethics is the study of the meaning and logical structure of moral beliefs. The purpose is to question the assumptions that inform normative ethics. So in meta-ethics, you might be asking whether or not there can be any such principle. So maybe none of the moral, normative, ethical principles that we promote, maybe none of those are valid and sound. Maybe there is no such thing as moral truth. Whenever you're engaging in a thought like that, you are engaging in meta-ethics. So here are some meta-ethical questions that we might ask. So on what grounds, so maybe it's religion, maybe it's something else, on what grounds can a moral principle be justified? What reason would we have to say that the libertarian principle is correct? Or, as I already mentioned, is there even such a thing as moral truth? Whenever you engage in these types of questions, you're doing meta-ethics. And then last, applied ethics, which is simply applying moral norms to specific moral issues or cases. And the purpose of this is to see if we can apply the principle to specific circumstances. So you might ask questions in applied ethics like, is physician-assisted suicide morally permissible? Now, Sarah might answer this question differently than Miles, not because they disagree on the facts of the issue, but because they disagree with their principles. So a utilitarian might answer this question differently than a libertarian would answer it. The same goes for the question, should our state implement strict drug legislation? So how you answer these types of questions usually will be determined by what principle you're arguing from. And so, again, this class is going to be focusing on all three of these: normative ethics, meta-ethics, and applied ethics. Now, the last section that we're going to be looking at is religion in morality. And this relates to meta-ethics. And the way that it relates to meta-ethics is that for many, when you start arguing about moral values, the question that comes up right away, and this is actually a question that we're going to be looking at in depth in our next lecture, but the question that often comes up is, are moral values objective or subjective? That is to say, is there something about moral truth that exists outside of human opinion? So that if I disagree with a moral value, what that means is that I'm wrong. In much the same way that if I disagree that there are trees in this world, well, I can disagree with that all I want, but the fact is there are trees that exist in the world. The existence of trees are objective. They really exist in the objective real world. Well, is that how moral values are? Are there moral values that exist objectively in the world outside of any human thought or perception? There are some who will argue yes to that question, and there are some who will argue no. For those who argue no, they're saying that moral values are subjective, which means that moral values exist only by what each individual subject says. Now, this gets more complicated than that. For now, I'm simplifying it. Next lecture, we'll get into some of the nuances of this. But when you say that moral values are subjective, you are saying that it's based upon human opinion. So when we get to the relationship between religion and morality, usually where this question comes up is when we're trying to ground moral objectivism. So if someone wants to argue that moral values are objective, not just based upon human opinion, then the next question is, how do these moral values get set? Who decides what is objectively right and what is objectively wrong? Well, those who argue for divine command theory will argue that God is the one who decides what is right and what is wrong. It's based upon the will of God. So objective moral values come from God. Now, there is a famous argument against this position known as the Euthyphro dilemma. And the Euthyphro dilemma asks this question: is an action morally right because God wills it to be so, or does God will it to be so because it is morally right? So here is the horns of the dilemma. If you say that moral values are the standard that God appeals to, in other words, God wills something to be so because he's appealing to some higher moral standard, then here's the problem with saying that. You are saying that God is not the highest standard. Well, what follows from that? What follows from that is that morality does not depend upon God. It exists without God. If you take God out of the equation, a moral standard still exists. So this is one dilemma that is presented towards those who believe in divine command theory. If you say that right actions are willed by God, then okay. Is God always appealing to some higher moral standard? If you say yes, then you're saying morality doesn't depend upon God. Okay, what if you flip that around? Is there a problem with that? Well, there is arguably a problem with that, and that is you start with the idea that God is the highest standard. So you're saying morality is dependent upon God. But if that's the case, what do we mean when we're talking about God? Well, God would be a subjective, personal being who decides what the moral standard is. So God is above the moral standard, so that is considered to be a good thing. But what's the consequence of believing that? The consequence of believing that is moral standards, therefore, are subjective and arbitrary based upon the person or the subject of God. In other words, moral values are not objective, but rather subjective. And so the question becomes, what makes the subject of God the right subject to determine what's right and wrong? Why can't it be my subject or your subject? We get back into the idea that moral values are just subjective and not objective. So is there a solution to this that is proposed by those who believe in divine command theory? And there is one, and so you'll have to evaluate whether or not you think this is a good solution. But some will argue God just is the moral standard. You can't separate the two. And so in this case, somebody who holds to a divine command theory will bite the bullet and say, yes, moral values are subject, but moral values, and if we want to say objective moral values, cannot exist without an objective moral subject. Someone who knows all, sees all, is all wise, and what type of being would that be but God? And if that's the case, then God is the ultimate subject who grounds moral values. So yes, the divine command theorists will say moral values are not objective in the way that trees are objective, like moral values aren't objects. They are judgment calls. They are saying this is right and this is wrong. But to be able to have an objective right and wrong, you have to have an objective ultimate subject who determines what is right and wrong. Hopefully I said that right. So you have to be an ultimate subject, not an ultimate object, to say that there is right and wrong. And so that is the argument for and against divine command theory. So that is the lecture for this week. Make sure that you read the chapter carefully and do the assignments that are on D2L. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me and let me know. Thanks.